I wanted to add a few exercises and ideas about extracting practice from etiquette and like formal arrangements of behavior or relationships to material like clothing or swords. Using a couple of stories from my own personal experience, not all of them from Budo. The first one is about meeting a flower arranging teacher in my house when I lived in Narutaki in the west of Kyoto, which had a beautiful picture window upstairs looking over the mountains of Arashiyama, the river area in the west of Kyoto, whose name means Storm Mountain, and it's quite beautiful. Tago-san is behind it. And I had been living there for some years, and so this was like the view out the window over cherry trees and so on. And one day I had lunch with a flower arranging teacher and her husband in that room, and she was explaining the three-dimensional nature of flower arrangement, just briefly, how they wanted one piece of foliage that came forward to catch the eye and bring it into the arrangement, and others which had different dimensions. And as she did it, she used my view out the window of the mountains to demonstrate that things were three-dimensional. And she said, for example, if you see this hill in the foreground, then you follow the line of it back, you can see that there's all this depth between that hill and the valley behind it and the mountains behind that, and then this major mountain in the background. There was a kind of depth field there. And as she said it, I saw it. And I cannot explain how I'd never seen that before, but for some reason the background was simply background. It was kind of two-dimensional to me. And then as she pointed it out, suddenly it was three-dimensional. And the alteration in my depth perception was permanent. I would go up into that room and sit and look out after that and remember that and see the three-dimensionality of the way mountains go from foothills to high mountains, and the way valleys fall away from you as they go up. And so I was practicing what she'd said, I think. But now I have a permanent three-dimensional kind of appreciation for landscape. That process, I think, is what etiquette and culture, in fact, generally, is attempting to teach. It's a permanent alteration of sensed reality which occurs. And it doesn't require effort to maintain it. I don't have to make an effort to do that anymore. It's simply part of my perception of the world. And so, number one, you have to be a bit careful about what you're making permanent. And number two, it's not a matter of effort. It's a matter of the situation or the thing or the room or the relationship altering you in some way. And so the example I gave of my sensei, I would like to give just some how I used that for practice, as how I practically use those things in my normal life. The example I gave from my sensei of walking across a room and there's an armed man sitting in front of you and you have to go in front of or behind him. So to turn that into a practical exercise that is not something which would induce paranoia or anxiety. Enter into a space which has people in it, preferably a safe space like tea after church or a family barbecue or something. And then don't enter anybody's blind spot as you move around in that space. Practicing that, moving through space without entering other people's blind spots, teaches you where all the blind spots are, right? And where your own is. If you wish to make it a little bit more formal, then as you move through and you choose not to enter blind spots to the best of your ability, sometimes, movement is complicated, but there are many different blind spots, so, you have to make a judgment call. As you move through and you come to your peripheral vision, turn and say, "Excuse me," to the person. That gives a kind of physical embodiment element to this kind of practice. simply doing that at a certain point alters your sense for how the people around you are oriented and what they are looking at and concerned with. Right. The second half of that exercise is that when people come to you and step either in front of or behind you, notice it. And when they step behind you, turn and look at them and nod as they go into your blind spot. Therefore, A, taking away the blind spot, but B, noticing how people are moving towards you in the room. Right. This is like the inverse of the previous exercise. The practice of doing that at a certain point switches on a background sense of how everybody in the rooms you entered are oriented. It has some odd and interesting side effects. You become much more aware of how people are interacting, and it improves your hospitality in a way, and a sense of kindness in some ways for what people are doing and who is lonely and who is how people are facing and interacting simply becomes a background awareness that switches on. It's a very, very interesting thing, and I kind of recommend it. Two other stories about the etiquette of things, which is the experience of letting a thing itself teach you what it is and teach you important lessons. It's possible at this point to go into a kind of Alfred North Whitehead panpsychism or animism kind of sense of the world as alive. It's not necessary, though. The things that I learned most from, I am in no illusion about them being living things, but I learnt a lot from a wooden sword that was made for me when I was asked to teach in Uzbekistan about a decade ago, and my hakama. The wooden sword was constructed for me. They had no tradition of wooden swords in Tashkent, in Uzbekistan. So they made some for me at a local furniture factory that one of my students owned, using my own sword as a copy and using cut-off fruit wood, pear and apple and apricot woods, as the source material. And they were very impressionistic, like they vaguely resembled swords. And they were very light, and so I broke the first 8 of them, or practicing with students. And the 9th one I kept and preserved and polished the nicks out of after training every night with sandpaper and oiled regularly, and it was the most beautifully balanced piece of wood. And it fit my hand in some odd way, and my feeling is that that sword taught me most of what I know about speed and coordination of the body. And I cannot really explain that, because all of the information about speed and articulation I definitely learned from people. But that information didn't help me. Somehow that piece of pear wood, which I treated with great respect, and was careful with and listened to in a way, because it felt quite different from the heavier, more robust swords that I normally practice with, where you can kind of let them take impact. This particular sword I couldn't let take any impact or it would shatter. And so I had to be just better organized than anybody I was practicing with. The sword taught me stuff, that piece of pear wood, that I am still to this day enormously grateful for, and I'm regretful that I left it in Uzbekistan. I had intended to go back to Uzbekistan, and then I didn't have the chance, so it's still there somewhere. The other thing I learned was from my hakama, which in the future I'll do some information about wearing and putting on hakama, because I think it's interesting and important. I learned a lot about my center, my belly, from the hakama, which hugs the belly tightly while leaving the legs and the leg joints free. If I look at video of myself from my first 15 years of training, I look like a little girl swirling around in a long dress, playing costume dress-ups, and feeling somewhat uncomfortable, because it didn't quite suit my nature or my physicality or anything like that. And I noticed this was true of some of my senpai as well. And I thought, well, maybe it's just a fact that Asian people's proportions are slightly different to Caucasians, and it doesn't quite suit us, right? And I was nervous about tripping over it, and as a result, my center of gravity stayed high in my body. And so, as I said last time, the hiking up of the hakama, as a friend suggested, altered some of that. But my tradition is to wear the hakama long, and so I still wore it long quite often. And at some point, after I've been training about 20 years, suddenly the sensation in my belly changed. And this was a result of many things, and training and teaching, of course. But my subjective feeling is that the hakama taught my center what it was. And suddenly I stopped kicking against the ground, and suddenly the cloth stopped swirling around me and started to move with me. And suddenly it sat straight and clean, and suddenly it was a part of me rather than being separate to me. And suddenly moving from the center became a real thing that I understood in a physical and embodied way. And I feel like I learned that from that piece of cloth. And so the practical exercise to take from that is that now I often practice in street clothes as a result of that experience, because I want to bring that kind of feel into normal moving around. And so now when I buy clothing, I put it on and I feel what it's trying to teach me, and write it down in a notebook. And it's like, what parts of my body is this emphasizing in terms of my physical sensations? How does it make me feel in terms of my posture? Does it make me feel cramped or loose? Does it make me feel open or floppy or disciplined? Not what I look like, and not what I look like to other people, and not how appropriate it is for my social situation or my work, but how does it affect my sense of being here? One thing I learned from this practice is that I dislike t-shirts. There is something about the edge of the collars of t-shirts that I just feel tearing at my carotid arteries, and I rarely wear t-shirts as a result. I always wear collared shirts if I can manage it. And that may be entirely idiosyncratic, right? I'm not saying that anybody else should copy what I do, but noticing that, and letting the material that surrounds me teach me is a part of good Reiki. And bringing it out of the dojo into normal life is a good idea, I think. These are simple examples. There's a whole. I hope in the near future to do a series on like formal etiquette, like bowing and standing up and sitting down, that my sensei thought was very important, and tying clothing and entering a room and these kind of things. Not because I think they should be copied, but because I think they should be learned from. And as we get into kata, you'll see where I'm going with this, right? That I believe that kata, like the formal arrangement of physical movement, is a kind of embodied physical poem of a sort. And I mean poem not in the sense of beautiful words, but in the sense of wisdom our predecessors thought was really important, and important enough to try and encode in a way that was easy to remember, which is what I think poetry often is. It's images and phrases that can be passed down orally, and consequently are designed to sit in your brain so that you remember them when you need them, right? And I think a lot of poetry is that, and I think kata are like that. They are arrangements of movement which contain enormous amounts of information. And so starting with like these ideas about clothing or movement or politeness, and moving into physical interactions is the basic path I'm going to take into sword and jujutsu kata and aiki no jutsu kata as well as we go on. So those two exercises, if you would like to try them, and tell me if they influence you in any way. The sudden click that came with that depth perception thing makes me think sometimes these things just click for you, and whether that's practice or whether you've previously done some unconscious work on it, I don't know, but it's not a thing which requires effort when it's done well. Yeah, anyway, onward. Thank you.